Grace and peace to you in the name of Jesus Christ. One of the many paradoxes in our life of faith is that endings and new beginnings oftentimes happen in the same place, at the same time, in the same moment. Is that they can't exist one without the other. Is that new beginnings, new starts, new life often and always comes from those places where something else is coming to an end. Our children know this more often than we do sometimes. This last week, I had the opportunity to travel to California to visit my wife's family, her sister and brother-in-law and their 3 kids. And our oldest nephew, Mark, who's 11, from almost the first day we arrived, said, "I'm so excited you're here. This is great." And then within just a moment, he would turn and he would say, "Oh, but I hate it because it means you're going to leave." Right? Do you all know that feeling? Where the good new thing that's happening comes with that same weight of knowing that something is going to come to an end. And that paradox, those two things being held together, they oftentimes cloud our ability to be fully present in the moment, looking and watching for great moments of joy and life that are there. Right? If you think about our nephew Mark, every time he may be thinking about us leaving and what that moment might be at the very end and the sadness that's going to come, doesn't allow for him to be fully present in the moment of playing and enjoying the moment all together as a family, nor does it allow him to see what is going to come after we leave. A moment to be back together with family, decorating for Christmas, going back to school and playing with friends, in which he will probably have just as much fun as he had while we were there. But it's what we focus on. It's what we're watching for. It's what we are in the midst of that often colors and changes what our experience of the moment is. Fortunately, we have a season called Advent where we turn to scriptures like the one we have today that help remind us that we have to be very intentional as people about how it is we prepare our hearts to be in the moment, how it is that we prepare ourselves to see the new thing that God is doing already in the midst of the endings of moments in our lives. This is the great paradox of our faith that Jesus is always striving to show us in his death and resurrection. Jesus is helping us as people turn to not be overwhelmed by the sorrow and the grief and the loss of the tomb, but instead to always be looking for where there is going to be new life emerging from those places of death, from those moments of things coming to what feels like a sorrowful end. But we have to learn, we have to practice what it looks like to look for these moments, to focus on the new life emerging, just like the plants outside in the midst of the spring. We know our spring doesn't emerge very quickly here in Colorado. And oftentimes it's not until the end of April or beginning of May that you start to see those shoots pop up from the ground or come off the trees. But just like from Luke's gospel, that is what we are called to turn our attention and sight towards. How is it we are looking for those new shoots of life when it feels like everything is coming to an end around us, where things still feel barren and without life? That's the context of this gospel from Luke that we receive on this first Sunday in Advent. Just like 2 weeks ago when we had a lectionary passage from Mark 13, Luke's gospel, Luke 21, comes in the midst of a community when it was written that was dealing with what felt like the end of all things. Luke's gospel was likely written sometime after the Judean-Roman War. The second temple had been destroyed. The people of Jerusalem and the people of the communities that Luke's gospel were written in the midst of were a people wondering, what in the world is God doing next? Because it feels like the world is falling all apart all around us. All of the apocalyptic language in Luke 21 today simply means revealing. It doesn't mean predicting that destruction will come, although we know cycles of history have brought cycles of destruction. What Luke 21 is doing is revealing reality, the holy reality that things fall apart, that things come to an end, that loss and sorrow is a part of what it means to be human, that suffering is a part of our reality. But in the midst of this apocalyptic section of encouraging us to look for the signs, the author of Luke's gospel, through the words of Jesus, is encouraging us to not be overcome by our sorrow and our grief and our loss, or to be overwhelmed by our fear of what is happening in our lives or the world around us, but instead to turn our attention to what it is that God is bringing, which is hope and the promise of something new emerging from this ending. Don't be weighed down with drunkenness means don't be caught numb. Because isn't that what we tend to do in the midst of grief and sorrow as people and collectively as a world? We numb ourselves. We say we can't deal with what this feels like happening all around us today, so let me just cut myself off from it. Or perhaps we go the other direction. We start to worry, as the passage talks about, and we become overcome by anxiety, not knowing what will come next, but instead just anxiously ruminating over all of the possibilities of the terrible thing that might happen. God's people have been in these places even prior to the early church in Luke's gospel. If you look to the predictions of the Messiah to come, those predictions out of the words of Jeremiah and Daniel and all of the prophets are coming from God's people when they are in places of exile, when they are in places where it feels like the life that God promised to them is never going to come, that they will always be wandering aimlessly under the rule of others or being lost in the wilderness. Our scriptures, our faith is meant to help us as people navigate these times where it feels like things are falling apart and things are coming to an end, but instead turn to how it is that we can look for new life. This always comes in the midst of difficult moments. As I was thinking of moments that I've encountered and can bear witness to of where it feels like a world is collapsing, but in fact there is new life. There's a story of a man named Jonathan who I've been thinking about this week. Jonathan was a man just about my age that I spent some time counseling as an intern at Abiding Hope down in Littleton a few years back. Jonathan was a war veteran from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And by the time I met him, he had already retired from his life of service, and he had married a woman who he had met in the service from Germany, and that they had a young girl named Sophia. Probably not too much younger than my son Sam at the time, probably 2-3 years old, somewhere in that range. Jonathan came to me and we began to talk about what was happening in his life, and it wasn't pleasant. That during the early time of his life as a new parent, his wife had gone through multiple mental health crises. That the woman that she was when he married her was not the same woman that she had become in those years after she had given birth to their daughter. That there had been multiple infidelities. That there were days of depression and days of much anger and sometimes even borderline abuse. And by the time we had been talking, he had come to the realization that this relationship that he was in with the mother of his child was likely not going to last. That he had tried everything, counseling, therapy, all of the pieces to try and make this work, but it was going nowhere. And he knew as we talked that his world that had been so carefully constructed and committed to was likely going to come to an end. And where we started in our conversations was around timing. Well, when is going to be the right time to talk to a lawyer? When is the right time to start to talk to her about divorce? When is the right time to start looking at what child custody may be like? And I resonated with this. He often wanted to just pull out his calendar and start saying how many weeks or how many months. We call that in our theology chronos. Many of us operate through chronos, which is just sort of the passing of time. It's the time that we use our watches for. The time that says, well, today it's 10:30, or tomorrow will be the 29th of November. And we like to plan our lives out based on chronos, on when we want things to happen. But God doesn't work in the midst of chronos time. God works in the midst of kairos time, a time that requires discernment, careful watching and listening for what God is up to before we take any decisive action. And we talked about the difference of those two things, and I asked him a question. And I said, in the midst of wondering about when you want to talk to your wife about a divorce, in the midst of when you need to grapple with what's going to happen with your daughter, what do you think God is up to right now? What is God doing that is creating life for you in the midst of everything falling apart? Jonathan, he paused for a second. And a little tear came to his eye, and he said, you know what I've been doing? Because I'm really afraid that when we get divorced, my wife is going to take our daughter to Germany with her, and I won't ever see her. So I've started dancing with her. And he said that when he has moments alone without his wife around, that he would just put on music and start bringing her up into his arms and dancing. And he said, I've never been so close to my daughter, and I've never felt so alive. That's the new thing. In the midst of everything collapsing and falling apart, there's something new that God was doing in that moment that was full of love, that was full of joy, and that was full of a tenuous hope. That even though things might fall apart, that there might be an opportunity for something new to happen in his relationship with his daughter, that maybe not all would be lost. Perhaps maybe you feel like that today. Maybe it's in the midst of your own grief and loss of someone in your life that has died, or might feel like they are in the midst of dying here soon. Maybe it's the loss of an ability. Maybe it's an illness, a struggle to regain health. Maybe it's a change in your family system, changing of a job, just thinking about change. Might feel like things are coming to an end. But today, on this first Sunday of Advent, we proclaim the great mystery and paradox of our faith, that God is always prepared to do something new. God is always going to create new life and new love if we look for it. In the midst of our world that feels like it is collapsing, climate change, racial and economic injustice, and everything that comes along with this moment, perhaps we need to turn to those green shoots to look for little signs of life, or perhaps just find a way to dance with the little ones that are entrusted to us, with the people that we have around us, and say, we can't fix everything. Things may fall apart, but let us leave that to God. Let us find that new life that God is drawing us into today. May God guide us on the season of waiting and watching and listening again this Advent. And may God bless us with new life and hope today. God's peace be with each of you. Amen.